vorwärts den Grund. Unter der Fahne leben wir, unter der Fahne leben wir, unter der Fahne tausend Grund, wagen wir alle nach vorwärts den Grund.
Nicht der Staat befiehlt uns, sondern wir befehlen dem Staate. Nicht der Staat hat uns geschaffen, sondern wir schaffen uns unseren Staat. Die Bewegung, sie lebt und sie steht felsenfest begründet. Und solange auch nur einer von uns atmen kann, wird er diese Bewegung seine Kräfte leihen. An mir zur Gruppe stoßen, zum Gau der Gau, und dann wird endlich diese gewaltige Kolonne der geeinten Nation nachfolgen, das früher zerrissene Volk. Siegheil!
Berlin, 1945. Berlin, 1914. There are no ruins yet. They go to war with flags flying and bands playing, bursting with pride for their country. Those people not familiar with politics were blinded by the pomp surrounding the Kaiser and believed in all the legends attributed to generals like Ludendorff and Hindenburg, especially as these two had successfully held back the advance of the Russians in the east and had ultimately assumed command of the entire German army. Yet in reality the war was brutal. It outstripped all previous wars in terms of its scale and showed the terrible destruction wrought by modern weapons, especially gas and the new tanks. For the first time, battles were fought in the air, and the deadly U-boat made naval warfare even more horrific. The war destroyed many empires. The Russian was the first to fall. In 1917, the Bolsheviks assumed power in Russia. In 1918, Lenin concluded peace with Germany. The revolution spread to Germany as sailors in Kiel sparked off their revolution after the last major offensive at sea failed. The Kaiser abdicated and Germany was declared a republic. Karl Liebknecht, the only member of the former Reichstag parliament not to vote in favour of the war, attracted a great deal of interest among the people. The real power in the empire lay with the moderate Social Democrats supported by the army, or the Reichswehr, who ordered the army to put down the revolution, during which Liebknecht and many of his supporters were murdered. Down with Liebknecht. The victors dictated their terms at Versailles, in which the new republic was forced to pay for the war the Kaiser had lost. Alsace and Lorraine became part of France. Posen and Western Prussia were handed over to Poland, and Memel was given to Lithuania. Germany lost all its colonies and was forced to reimburse the victors for the costs of the war. Elsewhere, the empire remained intact. The Free City of Danzig retained its German affiliation. The Rhine Valley was made into a demilitarized zone, but stayed in German hands. The defense industry was destroyed and the army was restricted to 100,000 professional soldiers. However, whilst the sovereignty of Germany was preserved, the conservative element in Germany viewed the Treaty of Versailles as a humiliation for the Republic. Fanatical nationalists blamed the disastrous outcome of the war on the political leaders of the Republic. Unpopular politicians such as Rathenau, the foreign minister, were murdered because they were willing to comply with the terms of the peace treaty. In Bavaria, the Reichswehr and Volunteer Corps, or Freikorps, took matters into their own hands, refusing to recognize the authority of the Reich government. General Ritter von Epp funded extremist nationalist groups out of secret Reichswehr funds. His adjutant, Hauptmann Röhm, employed spies to trail these groups. One of them became a member of the small German Labour Party, or Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, and not satisfied with just monitoring their movements, in the course of time he became their leader. The poster announces the speaker as Adolf Hitler. By 1920 he was already speaking out against the peace treaties with the Western powers, both in pamphlets and in public. Adolf Hitler, the man destined to become the Führer of a greater Germany, was born on the 20th of April 1889 in the small Austrian town of Branau. He was the son of a customs officer, Alois Hitler, and his third wife. The family moved to a small house in Leonsing near Linz when Adolf was just 8 years old. This was where the critical conflict between the father and son took place. Alois Hitler wanted his son to become a civil servant, whilst Adolf wanted to become an artist. He was a very average pupil and attended Linz Middle School. He was finally forced to leave school at 16 without any qualifications, suffering from lung disease. In 1907 he moved to Vienna, where he made 2 unsuccessful applications to join the art academy. However, he stayed in Vienna and survived by doing odd jobs and selling postcards he had painted. For a long time he lived in a men's hostel in Melmanstrasse. This is the hotel register. It was now that he bought his first anti-Semitic pamphlets. This one reads, "Are you blonde? Then you're in danger." At this time, Hitler visited the Ostara publisher Jörg Lanz von Liebenfels, who'd founded a society for blonde-haired, blue-eyed men in 1900. According to Lanz, the Germanic tribes had a special way of sitting. They had more slender toes than their inferior black-haired counterparts, and Lanz was calling for their extermination even then. According to him, history was an eternal struggle between light and dark, and the Jews were embodied in the root of this evil, and the swastika was his symbol. Theories such as these were a revelation for Hitler, now an unemployed, half-starved crank, who had need to believe in some distinction between peoples and races so that he could count himself as a member of this master race. By the time Hitler was facing call-up, he'd already left Austria and gone off to Munich. Nevertheless, his papers still managed to reach him. Fearful of getting into trouble with the police, Hitler reported for military service, but was exempted on the grounds of ill health. He went on to lead the same sort of life in Munich as he had done in Vienna. On August 1st, 1914, he stood in Odeonsplatz amongst a cheering crowd, listening to the announcement of the declaration of war. He volunteered 2 days later and became a messenger in the infantry regiment List. He was wounded in 1916 on the Western Front, but returned to the front in 1917 as a lance corporal. In 1918 he was wounded during a British gas attack, temporarily blinded, and found himself in a military hospital when the armistice was declared and the war ended. This left him unemployed again, a man with no job, no family, and no prospects. He decided to become a politician and went back to Munich, where some of the most fanatical nationalists had gathered. The Freikorps had originally been organised to defend the eastern border under the command of the Reichswehr. Now they were gathering to bring down the Republic. For men like Epp and Röhm, the Freikorps volunteers constituted the foundation for a future German army. Röhm discovered Hitler's talent and enrolled him in the Reichswehr. But on the 1st of April 1920, Hitler left to devote himself full-time to the new National Socialist Party. As their speaker, he put into practice his theory that the person who was able to move the masses would ultimately become their leader. His followers marched through the streets in uniform, making open threats of political terror. Hitler knew that many people were attracted by the display of violence, and many more would be silenced by it. Unemployed former officers such as Goering and fanatical racists such as the schoolteacher Streicher also joined the party. In 1923 they began to join forces with other paramilitary groups, and General Ludendorff became their front man. The difficult economic situation made it impossible for Germany to be able to keep up its reparation payments to France, and in response the French troops occupied the Ruhr Valley, dealing the final blow to the old greatly devalued Reichsmark. At a stroke, many Germans were robbed of their entire life savings. Hitler blamed the democratic system for the crisis, but was still too weak to stage a coup and bring down the Reichstag government. So he tried to rally anti-republican support, and on the 8th of November 1923 made a desperate attempt to win the support of the Bavarian government and the army by forcing his way into a meeting of the heads of state to proclaim a national government. However, the Reichswehr remained neutral. Berlin proclaimed, "The government led by the November criminals has today been declared unconstitutional. A provisional government has been formed consisting of General Ludendorff, Adolf Hitler, General von Lossow and Oberst von Seefert." On the 9th of November, Ludendorff and Hitler marched on the headquarters of the Reichswehr in Bavaria in an attempt to salvage the situation. Many people who were later to gain notoriety joined them on the march, including Heinrich Himmler. The police tried to halt the procession, ending in a shootout with 16 demonstrators and 3 policemen lying dead or dying on the street. Hitler managed to escape, but was arrested 2 days later. He was sentenced to a prison term at Landsberg, where he enjoyed the privileges of a large cell room, good food, and was allowed to wear his own clothes. During this period, his loyal friend Rudolf Hess took down the notes for his book My Struggle or Mein Kampf. In this book he proclaimed that his main aim in life was the unification of Germany and Austria, and that Germany should not allow any other major military power to exist in Europe. He presented a program in which he proposed war with France and an aggressive stand against the East. He believed that gassing 12,000 Jews at the right time could save the lives of 1 million superior Germans. The book was read by few and ridiculed by many, but a few years later it would no longer be a laughing matter. While Hitler was in Landsberg, President Ebert died and his successor was Field Marshal Hindenburg, the right-wing party candidate. At first, Hindenburg kept strictly to the terms of the Constitution, but gradually his age, lack of experience in politics, and military way of thinking began to show through. When Hitler left Landsberg, he had to rebuild the party from scratch, using his old, tried and tested methods. This political poster states, "A large mass public meeting will feature Adolf Hitler speaking out on Germany's future and our movement." Meanwhile, elsewhere, Dietrich Franken asks, why is Adolf Hitler not allowed to speak? In 1926, the party had 17,000 members. By 1927, 40,000, and in 1928, 60,000. The streets had not yet been taken over, and the trams carried on regardless, without making way for the columns of brown shirts. The Nuremberg party congresses were turned into demonstrations by SA stormtroopers and veterans. New organisations were created by the party. One of these was the Schutzstaffel, or SS. During these cleverly organised public meetings, Hitler staged flag inauguration ceremonies and gave rousing speeches, full of condemnations, to the party faithful, to which they responded with one joyous voice. In 1926, he found the man who would be responsible for party propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. Now the political battle was waged with all means available. Beatings and staged public brawls became a daily occurrence, and the mainstream parties began to muster their own paramilitary organisations. The Social Democrats called theirs Reichsbanner groups, while the Communists had their own Red Front combat units. Under Thälmann's leadership, the Communists became far more active than before. Youth is the purest and brightest flame of the revolution. Hitler's tireless agitation and the threatening demonstrations by his SA stormtroopers were welcomed by the industrialists. They needed somebody to mobilize the masses against communism. Money from industry began to flow into the party coffers. Hitler also exploited the fears and despair of the unemployed, whose numbers increased to 3 million in 1930. Hitler gave them something to believe in and promised work and bread.
Gerade 7 Mann hoch war, sprach sie schon 2 Grundsätze aus. Erstens, sie wollte eine wahrhaftige Weltanschauungspartei sein. Und zweitens, sie wollte daher kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland.
This manifesto gave Hitler over 6 million votes and 106 seats at the Reichstag elections in 1929, making him the leader of the second largest party. Chancellor Brüning had no parliamentary powers to take emergency measures and rule against the will of the Reichstag on the basis of paragraphs in the Constitution which allowed President Hindenburg to pass emergency decrees. Hitler declared the Brüning government useless and changed his tactics. He decided he did not want to bring about revolution until he was in power, meaning terror tactics could be ratified by law. The police would have no grounds to act against the SA, and he might be able to win the confidence of the Reichswehr as a result. In a number of court cases involving his supporters, Hitler claimed that he intended to come to power by peaceful constitutional means, and the lawyer Hans Frank assisted him in this cause. The banner reads, SA stormtroopers from the coast are canvassing for Adolf Hitler in the German Reich. From the unemployed to company directors, all believed Hitler was their man. Industrialists from the heavy industry sectors such as Kierdorfer and Thyssen funded Hitler's next election campaign. Seizing the political initiative, Hitler took his message to the country and, using the aeroplane as an early example of a campaign vehicle, flew from German town to meet the people and personally shake hands with the party faithful. Goebbels, ever vigilant and already a master of propaganda, coined the phrase Hitler above Germany. A poster proclaims Hitler for President of the Reich, but he only became a candidate for the post after he had obtained German citizenship and had been sworn in as a senior civil servant. On the 1932 ballot paper, Hindenburg was now the candidate representing the Social Democrats, the Centre and the Liberals. And who will save us from Hitler? Only Hindenburg can. Hindenburg was re-elected and Hitler found himself stuck in a rut, but his saviour was General von Schleicher, who wielded substantial power behind the scenes. He promised Hitler that he could arrange for the resignation of Brüning and call for new elections if Hitler supported a government led by Franz von Papen, a conservative politician whom Schleicher wanted to exploit for his own means. Schleicher himself was made a member of von Papen's cabinet of 7 barons, 2 industrialists and a lawyer. The fate of the nation was no longer dependent on the elected representatives in the Reichstag, but on the way in which Hindenburg exercised his authority. And these decisions were made during walks with his son Oskar, a friend of Schleicher's, or over coffee in Neudeck on Hindenburg's estate. These men were also involved in intrigues against one another. Schleicher forced von Papen out of office and became Chancellor of the Reich himself. In order to bring down Schleicher, von Papen proposed to Hindenburg that the government should be led by Hitler, and Hitler, Goering and Frick should themselves constitute a minority amongst conservative ministers. And so Hitler came to power as Reich Chancellor via the back door. Prussian President Braun allows himself to be dropped from the von Papen government without any resistance, and so social democracy loses its last vestiges of power to National Socialism. The excited crowd shout out, "We want to see our leader." The first public appearance of Hitler's new cabinet. Vice-Chancellor Franz von Papen sits next to Hitler and Goering, still naively thinking that he can control them. On the same evening as Nazi stormtroopers held a torchlight procession in honor of Hitler, other stormtroopers were terrorizing enemies of the regime. They were dragged out of their homes and onto the streets. In the following weeks, 99 people had been beaten to death and 1,125 wounded in vicious street battles. The first public manifestation of the new regime was the state funeral of an SS officer and a policeman who died during the fighting that night. Even the former Crown Prince showed his face in the hope of gaining support for the monarchy.
einem Sturm marschiert. Ein junger deutscher Arbeiter, aufrecht, stolz, der Kamerad seiner Kameraden und der Führer seiner Gefolgschaft. Wie all die anderen, die Hunderttausende, jeder vorbei an dem greisen Reichspräsidenten und dem jungen Reichskanzler. Das, was er geträumt hatte, das ist nun Wirklichkeit. Das junge und das alte Deutschland reichen sich die Hände.
On the 10th of February, Hitler held his first speech in Berlin as Chancellor of the Reich.
Unser Führer, der Reichskanzler Adolf Hitler, hat das Wort.
Goebbels introduces Adolf Hitler.
Deutsche Volksgenossen und Genossinnen. Am 30. Januar dieses Jahres wurde die neue Regierung der nationalen Konzentration gebildet. Ich und damit die nationalsozialistische Bewegung traten in sie ein. Ich glaube, dass nunmehr die Voraussetzungen erreicht sind, um die ich das vergangene Jahr gekämpft habe. Wir wollen nicht lieben und wollen nicht schwindeln. Ich habe deshalb es abgelehnt, jemals vor dieses Volk hinzutreten und billige Versprechungen zu geben. In uns selbst allein liegt die Zukunft des deutschen Volkes. Wenn wir selbst dieses deutsche Volk emporführen durch eigene Arbeit, durch eigenen Fleiß, eigene Entschlossenheit, eigenen Trotz, eigene Beharrlichkeit, dann werden wir wieder emporsteigen, genau wie die Väter einst aus Deutschland nicht geschenkt erhielten, sondern selbst sich schaffen mussten. Deutsches Volk, gib uns 4 Jahre und ich schwöre dir, so wie wir und so wie ich in dieses Amt eintrat, so will ich dann gehen. Ich tat es nicht um Gehalt und nicht um Lohn, ich tat es um deiner selbst wegen.
This characterized the beginning of an election campaign stained with the mark of terror. Goering made some 40,000 members of the SS and the SA into reserve police, thereby legalizing their terror tactics. On the 27th of February 1933, the Reichstag building burnt down. After the war, Goering admitted that he'd drawn up lists of communists who were to be arrested even before the fire took place. The fire, which was attributed to the communists in Goebbels' propaganda, provided the excuse for the introduction of a law which would outlaw Hitler's enemies. The Dutchman van der Lubbe was arrested as the arsonist. In the court case against him and the 4 communists charged, van der Lubbe was sentenced to death. The other 4 accused were acquitted. One of the accused, the Bulgarian Dimitrov, spoke out directly against the party to which the Reichstag President Goering belonged, claiming that they were the only party who could have had the opportunity to set the Reichstag on fire and so exploit the consequences, which infuriated the witness Goering.
Bekannt ist im deutschen Volk, dass die sich hier unverschämt benehmen und hierher gelaufen kommen, den Reichstag anstecken und dann hier mit dem deutschen Volk noch solche Frechheiten sich erlauben. Ich bin nicht hierher gekommen, um von Ihnen mich anklagen zu lassen. Sie sind in meinen Augen ein Gauner, der längst an den Galgen gehört.
The elections of March 5, 1933 saw the Nazi Party increase their votes to 44%, With the support of the nationalists, Hitler now had a 52% majority, but he still needed the support of both the Reichswehr and the German nationalists. Hitler arranged for the new Reichstag to be opened in Potsdam in order to link his government with the old Prussian traditions. The Reichswehr and SA paraded together. In other words, the old and new Germany welcomed one another, with the unknown soldier from the Western Front in his morning suit and the Field Marshal of the Empire in his traditional imperial uniform. Hitler speaks in the old garrison chapel.
Die Regierung der nationalen Erhebung ist entschlossen, ihre von dem deutschen Volk übernommene Aufgabe zu erfüllen. Sie tritt daher heute hin vor den deutschen Reichstag mit dem heißen Wunsch, in ihm eine Stütze zu finden für die Durchführung ihrer Mission.
2 days later, the party showed its true colours as the Reichstag met in the Krolleper to vote on the enabling laws. The building was surrounded by the SA and the SS. The condition was that the 81 communist votes were declared void and Hitler was supported by the German nationals and the centre, and only then could he give his dictatorship the appearance of legality. Hitler did not wait for this authority before taking over power throughout Germany. And by the 9th of March, a coup had already been staged in Bavaria.
Sie werden nicht die Erkenntnis aus dem Auge verlieren, dass es sich dabei nicht nur um das negative Problem der Bekämpfung dieser Lehre und ihrer Organisationen handelt, sondern um die Durchführung der positiven Aufgabe der Gewinnung des deutschen Arbeiters für den nationalen Staat. Die Reichsregierung beabsichtigt daher nicht, durch dieses Ermächtigungsgesetz die Länder aufzuheben. Wohl aber wird sie diejenigen Maßnahmen treffen, die von nun ab und für immer eine Gleichmäßigkeit der politischen Intentionen in Reich und in den Ländern gewährleisten. Es ist Sache des Reichstags nunmehr seinerseits eine klare Stellung einzunehmen. Am Schicksal des Kommunismus und der sich mit ihm verbrüdenden anderen Organisationen ändert dies nichts.
Epp and Röhm deposed the held government and occupied the main public buildings in Munich. The Reichswehr did not intervene against the SA, and all the old scores dating back to the failed coup of November 1923 were finally settled. Similar measures were undertaken in other states. Meanwhile, Göring kept a tight rein on Prussia.
Die Revolution vor wenigen Monaten durch ganz Deutschland brauste, begann sie damit, dass sie das furchtbare System der Vergangenheit, das System des Parlamentarismus, des Pazifismus, vernichtete und zerstörte. Der Führer hat uns auch in Preußen auf unsere Plätze gestellt. Wir geloben, dass jedermann in Preußen seine Pflicht tue. Der preußische Staatsrat ist eröffnet. Der ist eröffnet mit dem Rufe, unser Führer Adolf Hitler, des Deutschen Reiches Kanzler, ein dreifacher Sieg, Heil! Sieg, Heil! Sieg, Heil!
A few months after his assumption of power, Hitler had already banned all political parties apart from his own. The Stahlhelm fighter organisation for veteran soldiers was merged with the SA, and their government representative became a party member. The unions were disbanded and amalgamated as part of the party-controlled Workers' Front. The newly appointed propaganda minister Goebbels organised the battle against free speech. Heinrich Heine once wrote, "Where books are burnt, people are burnt too." Now his books were being burnt, and his Lorelei suddenly became known as just a piece by another unknown poet. Good Germans no longer read Marx or Freud, Barbus or Brecht, Mann or Remarque, Toller or Tchaikovsky, Zweig or Furtwängler.
Das nicht auf die Reinheit seiner Rasse hält, geht zugrunde.
The Jews are not wanted here. The shop opposite belongs to a Jew. We don't want the Jews. Jews are our downfall. Jews are undesirables. On the 1st of April 1933, a boycott was introduced against Jewish businesses, doctors and lawyers. Those suddenly deprived of their civil rights began to leave the country, and pictures of people being transported like cargo from one country to another were soon a common sight throughout Europe.
Führer, Sie sind Deutschland. Wenn Sie handeln, handelt die Nation. Wenn Sie richten, richtet das Volk.
Anyone who stood in Hitler's way was outlawed. Even Röhm was to learn this. In order to become Hindenburg's successor, Hitler needed the support of the Reichswehr. Röhm's essay threatened to encroach upon the traditional rights of the Reichswehr, and so in 1934 Hitler had Röhm and other veteran stormtroopers killed on the pretext that they were involved in an attempted coup against him, killings carried out by the SS. Then Hitler's Totenkopf units were made into an independent organisation. At the next party conference, Hitler received a solemn pledge of loyalty from the new leader of the SA, which had now been deprived of power.
Genau wie in früheren Zeiten wir unseren Dienst und unsere Pflicht getan haben, werden wir auch künftig nur auf Ihre Befehle warten. Und wir Kameraden kennen nichts anderes, als die Befehle unseres Führers auszuführen und zu beweisen, dass wir die Alten geblieben sind. Unser Führer Adolf Hitler sich
Meine Kameraden, wir stehen fest zusammen für unser Deutschland. Ich übergebe euch dann die neuen Feldzeichen in der Überzeugung, dass ich sie in die treuesten Hände gebe.
The new flags were consecrated by touching the blood flag commemorating November 1923. The army received its guarantees as the sole weapon bearers of the nation and did not suspect that the SS would soon realise the dream Röhm had of a special army for the party. When Hindenburg died on the 2nd of August 1934, a law was passed by the government on the same day, uniting the functions of the President and Chancellor of the Reich and appointing Hitler to this new office. Officers and troops swore allegiance directly to Hitler in person and not to the Constitution or the fatherland. Everything was then ready for the next stage, the organisation of the people into one mass marching column to follow their leader to the very end. So the Third Reich was shaped by Hitler's hand into the 1,000-year Reich, a state full of flags and mass public rallies where everyone is swept away in a wave of propaganda targeted at all groups and people of all ages.
Unter der deutschen Jugend der Zukunft wünschen ist etwas anderes, als was die Vergangenheit sich gewünscht hat. Wir müssen einen neuen Menschen erziehen. Als es uns gelang, dem deutschen Volk eine neue Idee zu geben und dieses Volk in diese Idee zu einen und zu einer neuen Lebensform zu führen, dies ist die größte Tat dieses Jahrhunderts für unser Volk. In unseren Augen muss der deutsche Junge der Zukunft schlank und rank sein, flink wie Windhunde, zäh wie Leder und hart wie Kruppstahl.
Labour service was made compulsory.
Ich melde, 4. Feldmeisterlehrgang mit 190 Führern zur Flaggenhissung angetreten. Danke sehr.
Heiliger!
Kein Wort, mein Kampf. Am 18. Juli 1925 erschien der erste Band des Führers Buch Mein Kampf. In diesem Buch gibt der Führer dem deutschen Volke einen Abriss seines schicksalshaften Lebensweges und gibt uns verpflichtend die grundsätzlichen Erkenntnisse des politischen Lebens. Als Leitspruch des Tages ein Wort des Führers über den Wert der Arbeit. Der völkische Staat wird, wenn notwendig, selbst durch jahrhundertelange Erziehung mit dem Unfug, körperliche Tätigkeit zu missachten, brechen müssen. Heil, Arbeitsmänner!
Heil, mein Führer!
Warten! Immer! Warten! Ab!
Kamerad, woher stammst du?
Aus Friesenland.
Und du, Kamerad?
Aus Bayern.
Und du?
Vom Kaiserstuhl.
Und du?
Aus Pommern. Und aus Königsberg.
Aus Schlesien.
Von der Waterkant. Vom Schwarzwald. Aus Dresden.
Von der Donau.
Vom Rhein.
Und von der Saar.
Ein Volk, ein Führer, ein Reich, Deutschland!
Wir standen nicht im Schützengraben und nicht im Trommelfeuer der Granaten und sind trotzdem Soldaten!
The Totenkopf division of the SS was employed against anyone who was not willing to be re-educated.
Wann ich die Augen schließen werde, weiß ich nicht. Aber dass die Partei weiterleben wird, das weiß ich. Und dass über alle Personen, über Schwache und Starke hinweg die Zukunft der deutschen Nation erfolgreich gestalten wird, das glaube ich und das weiß ich.
Those who did not firmly believe this were already in the concentration camps. The poet Erich Mühsam was murdered in Oranienburg in 1934.
Der Staat hat uns geschaffen, sondern wir schaffen uns unseren Staat. Nein, die Bewegung, sie lebt und sie steht felsenfest begründet. Und solange auch nur einer von uns atmen kann, wird er diese Bewegung seine Kräfte leihen und für sie eintreten, so wie in den Jahren, die hinter uns liegen. Dann wird zur Trommel die Trommel kommen, zur Fahne die Fahne, dann wird zur Gruppe die Gruppe stoßen, zum Gau der Gau, und dann wird endlich diese gewaltige Kolonne der geeinten Nation nachfolgen, das früher zerrissene Volk.
In 1935, Hitler introduced general conscription and began to build up an army consisting of 36 divisions with a modern air force. All the rest of the world did was to register mild protest at this. Hitler lulled foreign diplomats into a false sense of security. So he concluded a non-aggression treaty with Poland, as he did not yet feel powerful enough to attack that nation. He thereby drove a wedge between the system of alliances of France and at the same time managed to convince them of his peaceful intentions. The French government were in favour of appeasement with their former enemies and raised very few objections when Hitler marched into the Rhine in March 1936. If France had only deployed a few of their divisions against his 3 battalions, Hitler would have had to withdraw. Hitler also exploited the tension between Mussolini and the League of Nations following Italy's invasion of Abyssinia. England and France made no more than symbolic gestures of protest against Mussolini, which were of no real consequence to him and merely drove Italy into the arms of Germany. In July 1936 in Spain, General Franco led the revolution against the constitutional Spanish government. Hitler and Mussolini went to his aid. Hitler sent soldiers, engineers and war materials to Franco over a period of 3 years, whilst officially denying any involvement. Mussolini supported Franco quite openly. The Western camp were divided about the fate of Spain, and they still hoped to reach peaceful agreement with the dictators, who had by then taken the initiative away from them completely. The Western powers did not choose to intervene in the developments taking place in Austria either. By 1934, Hitler felt ready and confident enough to annex an Austria under Dollfuss. However, in the spring of 1934, Dollfuss brutally smashed an uprising by the workers in Vienna and then tried to incite his nation to rise up against Hitler. On the day of remembrance for the liberation of Vienna from the Turks, Dollfuss compared that enemy with Hitler.
Diesen Tag und diese Zeit feiert, so ist es nicht eine gewöhnliche geschichtliche Erinnerung. Fremdgeist und fremde Ideen sind in unser Volk, haben sich eingenistet und haben böses Unheil angerichtet.
Hitler's followers in Vienna organized street riots that reached their height during the visit by the German ministers Frank and Kerl.
Vielen herzlichen Dank, lieber Parteigenosse und Mitkämpfer Frauenfeld, für den lieben Empfang, den Sie mir hier bereitet haben. Es ist eine unerhörte Freude, hier an der Stelle, wo unser Führer, der Schöpfer der nationalsozialistischen Arbeiterpartei Adolf Hitler, seinen Lebenskampf begonnen hat als einfacher Handarbeiter, hier an dieser deutschesten Stelle des Ostens erneut betonen zu können, dass unser Führer Adolf Hitler stolz ist auf seine Wiener Heimat und dass er weiß, dass Wien zu ihm und seiner Bewegung, zur Idee des Völkerfriedens, zur Idee der nationalen Wohlfahrt, zur Idee der Freiheit und Reinheit des Volkslebens steht.
In July 1934, Hitler's supporters carried out a failed coup. Dollfuss was murdered and the broadcasting house in Vienna was occupied. However, law and order was re-established very quickly. Those involved in the attempted coup fled to Germany in their thousands. Mussolini ordered Italian troops to be deployed on the Austrian border and promised to defend the freedom of the nation. The education minister Schuschnigg succeeded Dollfuss. Von Papen was appointed as Hitler's ambassador in Vienna and made the preliminary arrangements for the Anschluss with Austria by gradually occupying the state. In September 1937, Hitler and Mussolini met in Munich. The military show of power in Germany made such a great impression on Mussolini that he was soon willing to join the anti-Comintern pact between Germany and Japan. He also declared that he was no longer willing to defend Austria's independence, and this meant that there were no more obstacles preventing Hitler from proceeding to Vienna. The banner reads, "One people, one nation, one leader." In March 1938, the unemployed painter from the men's hostel in Meldmannstrasse marched into the old city centre of the Austrian Empire. He was welcomed by Himmler, who had 67,000 people arrested the night before. Truly a page from Mein Kampf.
Dieses Land und dieses Volk kommt nicht zum Reich in einer demütigenden Rolle. Ich selber führe euch ein.
The victorious conqueror was not satisfied with this triumph, for his attention had already been captured by another target, namely Czechoslovakia. His opponent, Beneš, was allied with France and had an undertaking from Russia for their aid in Prague, providing the French complied with their conditions. The Czechs were strong enough to rebuff any initial attack. When the Sudeten German National Socialists provoked a major crisis, Prague was mobilized. We know now that a number of German generals wanted to bring down Hitler on the outbreak of war against Czechoslovakia. Hitler would not have dared to become involved in a conflict which would have meant war with England and France in the west and Russia and Czechoslovakia in the east. The British Prime Minister Chamberlain flew to Berchtesgaden under these circumstances and was convinced that he would still be able to come to some agreement, despite the fact that he was dealing with dictators. He also represented France, whose Minister for Foreign Affairs, Daladier, was keen to avoid war at all costs. Chamberlain's campaign led to the Munich Agreement of the 29th of September 1938 between Germany, France, England and Italy. The Sudetenland was given to the Germans. The fate of Czechoslovakia was thereby sealed. Beneš was forced to submit to Hitler, who was now able to lay his hands on Czech strongholds, cannons, munitions and machine guns worth 2 billion marks, and was later able to use them to good effect in the blitzkrieg against France in the spring of 1940. The Western powers had abandoned their most loyal alliances in Central Europe and isolated the Soviet Union on the continent. Russia was now compelled to change track in its foreign policy. The German generals in opposition were forced to drop their plans for a coup. They could hardly arrest a man for war crimes since he had just won a victory without any bloodshed. Hitler was personally drawing up new invasion plans, whereas Chamberlain was convinced that Hitler would add his name to an agreement signed by Chamberlain which was to have secured peace in our time. The Munich Agreement was to worsen the position of the Jews in Germany. 1 week after the Munich Treaty was signed, all Jews had to have a letter J printed on their papers. Heydrich, Himmler's right-hand man, had 17,000 Polish Jews living in Germany deported to Poland. On the 7th of November, the son of one of those exiled shot a German diplomat in Paris to draw the world's attention to the tragic plight of the Jews. His victim was ceremoniously buried with full military honours, and this event was adopted as the excuse for the Kristallnacht, which turned into a pogrom and left its mark on the whole of Germany. Hundreds of synagogues were set alight. 7,500 Jewish businesses were plundered, 20,000 Jews were arrested, 10,000 of whom ended up being sent to the concentration camp at Buchenwald. The Jews were forced to foot the bill for the damages themselves, and they were also compelled to pay a collective fine of 1 billion marks. This signalled the final stage in the tragic history of the Jews. Now Hitler became more and more self-assured after the events in Munich. He occupied the independent part of Czechoslovakia in March. The Czechs were the first nation to be repressed in the Greater German Empire. Chamberlain finally began to understand that Hitler was just using the Germans abroad as an excuse for his expansionist policy, and that this was beginning to pose a threat to the whole of Eastern and Western Europe. Hitler's Nazi stormtroopers marched on. January 1939, Hitler's New Year's speech.
Wenn es dem internationalen Finanzjudentum in und außerhalb Europas gelingen sollte, die Völker noch einmal in einen Weltkrieg zu stürzen, dann wird das Ergebnis nicht der Sieg des Judentums sein, sondern die Vernichtung der jüdischen Rasse in Europa.
On his 50th birthday on the 20th of April 1939, Hitler's party and Germans from all corners of the nation came to pay homage to him.
Was ist unser heutiges Deutschland? Nicht wieder schön und herrlich. Indem ich euch überblicke, weiß ich, mein Lebenskampf ist nicht umsonst gekämpft. Ihr werdet treu sein, wie jemals nur Deutsche treu sein konnten. Immer wieder wird eine neue Jugend antreten in diese Stadt hier. Ich sehe das von mir in Jahrhunderten immer wieder antreten und wird immer schöner sein, immer kraftvoller sein und wird immer gesünder sein und wird immer mehr Hoffnung bieten den lebenden Geschlechtern auf die Zukunft. Ich bin nicht der Klagende, ich bin nur der Warner. Ich bin nicht der Fürstende, sondern ich bin nur der Vorbereitende. Ich zittere nicht vor der Stunde irgendeiner Entscheidung, aber ich will sie sehen und ich will stark sein. Ich will die Füße fest in unsere Erde stemmen, um dem Ansturm nicht zu erliegen. Und ihr werdet neben mir stehen, wenn diese Stunde jemals kommen sollte. Ihr werdet vor mir, neben uns, Seiten und hinter mir stehen. Und wir werden in unserem Zeichen wieder siegen.
On the 1st of September 1939, the German war machine trundled across the Polish border. The pact between Germany and Soviet Russia, in which the partition of Poland was laid down, gave Hitler the opportunity to do this. Hitler did not inform Germany or the Allies of the outbreak of war until after the attack on Poland had begun.
Habe ich nie kennengelernt. Es heißt Kapitulation. Und ich möchte daher jetzt der ganzen Umwelt gleich versichern, ein November 18 wird sie niemals während der deutschen Geschichte wiederholen.
England and France fulfilled their commitments as allies of Poland and declared war on Germany. This was the first time a united front had opposed Hitler. What use was the blessing of the Church or the fierce fighting spirit of the Poles against a superior enemy? The German Air Force bombed trains on their way to the front and destroyed planes on the ground. After a fierce but brief battle, the northern port of Danzig was annexed by the German Reich. Polish cavalry attacked tanks. Hitler's Stukas attack a railway station. Hitler's army advanced through the barren countryside littered with the burning remains of towns destroyed and abandoned, and whose people had been defeated but had still not surrendered. Partisans were taken prisoner, but even their executions still failed to stop the resistance. The destruction spread to new areas all the time. Bridges were bombed and Polish forces were surrounded. Hitler thanked his soldiers for their good work in achieving this destruction. His right-hand man was Himmler, who organized the terrorization of the occupied areas. After a few weeks, the only remaining stronghold was Warsaw. Hitler was infuriated by the grim resistance encountered in the Polish capital and openly gloated over the transformation of Warsaw into a burning wasteland. The whole world witnessed the suffering of a civilian population under all-out war for the first time. German soldiers advanced through the dead streets of Warsaw, surrounded by bombed-out houses. Meanwhile, their defeated Polish enemies began their journey to the concentration camps. Hitler staged a victory parade. Hans Frank was made Governor-General of Poland. The country no longer featured on the front pages of the newspapers around the world. The systematic plundering and murderous devastation of the occupied areas began in secret. Market day in a small Polish town. They're selling meat and vegetables in the normal way. The crowd are stirred by a German police raid. Jews should wear their armbands with their Jewish stars on their sleeves and not carry them in their pockets. Hostages are taken. The sight of the police car taking them away becomes part of daily life. The graffiti reads, "We're off to Poland to beat up the Jews." There are Jews-only trams in Warsaw. In October 1940, an area of 10 square kilometers was transformed into a ghetto, and you needed a special pass to leave it. Previously, this area of the city had been inhabited by 240,000 Jews and 80,000 non-Jews. These were now forced to move to make room for the hundreds of thousands of Jews who were later dragged there. At the beginning, there were 6 people to every room. This number soon rose to 13. Goebbels' cameraman took these pictures which follow. They show how a normal city was transformed into hell on earth. Originally, these pictures were to be used for propaganda purposes, but they decided not to on the grounds that the public might have sympathy with the victims instead of hating and despising them. At first, the ghetto was surrounded by a barbed wire fence. Later on, the Jews were forced to pay builders to build a wall. They were crowded in and caged like defenseless animals. The streets filled with people who once led normal lives. Now they wore rags and were forced to live on just 200 calories a day. Frank even went as far as to reduce this ration because he knew it would increase the number of deaths. But his excuse was that this war meant the annihilation of the Jews. How hard was life then for the Jews living in the ghetto? They lived in the stench of dirt, wet clothing, and corpses. They slept in rooms which had been turned into overcrowded prison cells. They lay on mattresses made of cardboard and straw, waiting for death and salvation. The children in the ghetto grew up in the shadow of death, plagued by vermin and illness, without laughter or games, with wise old eyes which were used to the sight of death and suffering. Even this act of tenderness is haunted by the threat of death. They begged or danced in the streets in the hope of evading death for one more day. The guards at the ghetto were merciless to their fate of death by starvation. Children risked death by smuggling vegetables into the ghetto. People stood or sat as close as possible to the walls of the houses to catch the heat coming from them. Signs of an epidemic. If anyone was suspected of having typhus, the entire household was marched off to the bathhouse. There, those people who were still healthy were soon infected during the long periods in which they were left to wait. The epidemic was spread intentionally, although the excuse given was that they were actually trying to contain it. The dead and dying were left to lie in the streets. Those who were still alive hardly gave them a second glance. Tomorrow it might be their turn. The gravediggers were hardly able to keep up with their job of taking away all the bodies which were left abandoned on the streets until they were disposed of in a quiet mass grave and covered with a layer of lime. The anonymous sufferers vanished without trace or tears or protest. Another page from Mein Kampf. Outside this enclosed world, the Polish people were being subjected to a reign of terror. The resistance against the occupying power grew, and it was becoming more and more obvious that Hitler had sentenced the defeated to eternal slavery. Resistant fighters began to make their own weapons, fully aware that they might die from doing so. The homemade weapons shown here were taken from these prisoners. This battle was carried on in secret. The outside world did not find out about it until much later. Their attention was focused on the war in the West. On the 9th of April 1940, Hitler attacked Denmark and Norway. Only a year before, he had encouraged them to sign a treaty of non-aggression. They marched on across the border to Holland and Belgium. Then Hitler's superior tanks and air force annihilated the French line of defense within a few weeks. In June 1940, an armistice agreement was signed with France. The Peace of Versailles was thereby swept away, and German troops marched into Paris. England fought on alone as Goering's air force deployed all its resources in preparation for an attack against her. However, British planes remained superior over British airspace. Ruthless attacks on industrial towns and cities, such as here in Coventry, only served to unite the British people. The British prepared for a German invasion, but the order to invade England was never given, as 5 months after the fall of France, Hitler began to prepare for an attack on the Soviet Union. Only 2 years previously, he had also signed a treaty of non-aggression with Stalin.
Russland und Deutschland haben im Weltkrieg gegeneinander gekämpft. Und beide waren letztendlich die Leidtragenden. Ein zweites Mal soll uns jetzt das nicht passieren.
The invasion of the Soviet Union began over a large front. The aim was to force their way to Moscow as rapidly as possible. German troops once again advanced through burning towns and abandoned villages across the scorched earth of enemy territory. The Red Army withdrew inland after putting up a tough defense. German victories were extremely costly in terms of human lives. Only a few miles short of his prized objective, Hitler was unsuccessful in his bid to occupy Moscow. The army were unprepared for the hard winter. The Russians managed to hold back the German advance at Moscow, Sevastopol and numerous other strategic points. In the summer of 1942, Hitler attempted to force his way through to the oil wells in the Caucasus and the ripening cornfields along the Donau and Volga. He lost 80 divisions in this war. They were the ones who had to pay the price for his dream of world domination. In November, 3 Soviet armies north and south of Stalingrad staged a counterattack. They took the initiative away from Hitler. In a few short months, the war had transformed the city, once so beautiful, into a pile of rubble. This time, the Red Army were able to win back Stalingrad. They fought bitterly for every house and every street. On the 30th of January 1943, Hitler's Reich celebrated its 10th anniversary. The next day, Field Marshal Paulus capitulated in Stalingrad and was taken prisoner, together with 91,000 men. The Battle of Stalingrad cost the Germans 142,000 lives.
Und jeder Deutsche, noch in 1000 Jahren, muss mit heiligen Schauern das Wort Stalingrad aussprechen und sich erinnern, dass dort Deutschland letzten Endes doch den Stempel zum Endsieg gesetzt hat. 10 Jahre, meine Kameraden, hat uns der Führer jetzt von Größe zu Größe geführt, zum Heile, aus Ohnmacht heraus, aus Armut heraus, aus schrecklichen Verhältnissen.
German prisoners of war being marched through the city of Moscow.
Das Deutschland von 1 hat 11:45 die Waffen niedergelegt. Ich habe grundsätzlich immer erst 5 Minuten nach 12 aufgehört. Ich wollte zur Wolga kommen, an einer bestimmten Stelle, an einer bestimmten Stadt. Zufälligerweise trägt sie den Namen von Stalin selber, aber denken Sie nur nicht, dass ich deswegen dort losmarschiert bin. Sie könnte auch ganz anders heißen, sondern nur, weil dort ein ganz wichtiger Punkt ist. Weil ich kein zweites Verdun machen will. Ausgerechnet Stalingrad, ein kapitaler Fehler, das ein strategischer Fehler. Wollen wir mal abwarten, ob das ein strategischer Fehler war. Und da kann man schon mir glauben, was wir einmal besitzen, das halten wir dann schon auch tatsächlich so fest, dass in diesem Krieg jedenfalls ein anderer dort, wo wir stehen, nicht mehr hinkommt. Da kann man sich drauf verlassen.
The Battle of Stalingrad was the turning point in the war. It was soon followed by massive retreats. There was no more talk of a lightning war. It was enough just to be able to defend the positions. Human lives were still being lost in a senseless war. Slave workers from all the occupied countries were marched off to Germany to work in the defense industry. Up to the end of 1944, 4,795,000 men and women were deported to Germany from Russia, Poland, France, Belgium, Holland, Yugoslavia, and even Italy. They were arrested on the streets or dragged from their homes and taken away in cattle trucks. Many died on the journey. They were powerless to defend themselves against the ill treatment they received. Heinrich Himmler set up enormous concentration camps in Eastern Europe. Hundreds of thousands of people were taken there on a one-way trip of despair. Upon arrival, the healthy ones were used as slave labourers until their bodies were worked to a standstill, and then they were exterminated along with all the other wretched prisoners. Work means freedom was the motto of Rudolf Höss, the commander of the concentration camp at Auschwitz. But in his world, the only free people were the dead. At the Nuremberg trials after the war, Höss admitted that over 2.5 million people were killed at Auschwitz, including Poles, Russians, Gypsies and Jews. It was Höss's idea to use the hydrogen cyanide chemical Cyclone B for the mass extermination of the people. As he said himself, it brings about rapid and certain death and is particularly effective in crowded, dry, airtight rooms. The victims were led into gas chambers fitted with shower heads so as to make them look like bathhouses. The women and children went in first. The doors were then quickly closed and bolted, and the gas was then fed into chambers. After a maximum of 20 minutes, all the bodies were lifeless. A special commando troop removed the gold teeth from the bodies, and women's hair was cut off. Their spoils were then logged and employed for the war effort, and the corpses were burnt. In Auschwitz, the crematoria were capable of burning 9,000 bodies in 24 hours. In the summer of 1944, the vast majority of 400,000 Hungarian Jews were gassed within 2 months. This was how the Totenkopf division of the SS carried out the systematic extermination of the Jews as the first step towards a new order in Europe based on racism. Millions of people had to die because one man decided at the beginning of this century to hate the Jews more than anyone else. Now he had the power to order their extermination, and he was obeyed, for an order was an order and had to be obeyed. But those who were condemned to death or to a life of slavery did not always meet the same fate. In April 1943, the order to destroy the Warsaw Ghetto was given. The inhabitants managed to defend themselves against the SS and the police for almost 3 weeks, as the latter systematically burned down each house under the command of General Meyerstopp. The inhabitants had the choice to either stay in their houses or to jump down from the balconies into the streets. After the ghetto had been liquidated, the spoils of the victors amounted to just 9 rifles, 59 pistols, a few hundred hand grenades and incendiary devices. The unarmed victims surrendered to their executioners. They knew that they had to die, but they wanted to die with their heads held high. Most of those who surrendered were shot down in the street where they stood, and the ghetto they had valiantly tried to defend was razed to the ground. The battle in Poland continued. In the summer of 1944, the Russian army had reached the Vistula River. On the 1st of August 1944, General Bohr, the leader of the Polish resistance, gave the signal for the uprising. The Russian army had occupied a Warsaw suburb on the other side of the Vistula River, yet they took no action to assist the Polish resistance. It therefore took 63 days for it to be crushed. The death toll was high, and there was a great deal of bloodshed on both sides, during which the city was destroyed. On the 6th of June 1944, the Western powers landed in Normandy, and the battle that was to decide the fate of Europe began. The Russian offensive also brought the Eastern Front closer and closer to Germany. At this point, the German resistance, which was made up of people from all sectors of the population, including the old unions, the church, the upper classes, army officers and politicians, tried to change the situation. On the 20th of July, Oberst Klaus von Stauffenberg put a bomb under Hitler's table at his headquarters in East Prussia. As Hitler's concrete bunker was being repaired, his meetings were being held in a wooden hut, and this ultimately saved his life. The bomb blew away the roof and the flimsy walls. He received only superficial burns and one arm was paralyzed. The officers who were standing near to the bomb were either killed outright or severely injured. Hitler's revenge was grim, as over the next few months 4,980 people were executed and many thousands were sent to the concentration camps. The so-called National Supreme Court, led by Friesler, passed a long series of death sentences. Following the successful French campaign, Field Marshal von Witthaben, as the commander-in-chief of an army group, had received the honorary title of Marshal. At the first court hearing on the 7th of August, he was forced to stand in the dock without either a belt or braces.
Feldmarschall und ein Generaloberst erklären, Sie können es besser machen. Ihr unser aller Führer ist, ihr die Grenzen des Reichs an die Grenzen Europas. Wir kennen das. Sie werden verstehen, dass man so etwas mit dem Wort Ehrgeiz nie belegt hat. Da gucken Sie an. Gut auf.
Even veterans like Graf Feldorf, the chief constable of Berlin, were among the conspirators. He no longer believed in Hitler's conquest and also came under Friesler's damning accusations.
Die Einstellung der Partei zum Adel nicht zugesagt hat, ist mir nun völlig unverständlich. Sie waren Polizeipräsident der Reichshauptstadt. Oder ich könnte ihn, wie Sie wissen, Gruppenführer und Obergruppenführer nennen. Aller Gliederungen der NSDAP, die auch adlig war. Ich muss auch bekennen, dass ich nicht, wie viele meiner Parteigenossen, nämlich wie alle Parteigenossen, bedingungslos dem Führer ergeben bin.
Graf Schwerin von Schwanenfeld spoke of the mass murders taking place under this leadership.
Morde? Sie sind ja ein schäbiger Lump. Sprechen Sie unter der Gemeinheit? Ja oder nein? Sprechen Sie darunter? Ja oder nein auf eine klare Antwort? Nein, Sie können auch nicht mehr zerbrechen. Denn Sie sind ja nur noch ein Häufchen Elend, das vor sich keine Achtung mehr hat.
Im Namen des deutschen Volkes,
Ehrgeiz zerfressene, ehrlose, feige Verräter sind Karl Gördeler, Wilhelm Leuschner, Josef Wirmer und Ulrich von Hassel. Sie verschworen sich, Gördeler sogar als politischer Grund für unsere Feinde, mit einer Gruppe eidbrüchiger Offiziere, die unseren Führer ermorden wollte. Als Minister einer feindhörigen Verräterregierung unser Volk in dunkler Reaktion zu knechten und unseren Feinden auf Gnade und Ungnade auszuliefern. Statt mannhaft wie das ganze deutsche Volk dem Führer folgend unseren Sieg zu erkämpfen, verrieten sie das Opfer unserer Krieger, Volk, Führer und Reich. Sie werden mit dem Tode bestraft. Ihr Vermögen verfällt dem Reich.
After the unsuccessful attempt on Hitler's life, the Wehrmacht forces suffered an even greater humiliation as the Waffen-SS divisions were given the same rights and Himmler was made commander-in-chief of this parallel army. The Heil Hitler-style greeting was now introduced into the army as both a sign of eternal loyalty to the Führer and a mark of the close ties between the Wehrmacht and the party. But the war was coming closer and closer. Now they were fighting for German towns and cities.
Wollt ihr den totalen Krieg? Wollt ihr ihn, wenn nötig, totaler und radikaler, als wir ihn uns heute überhaupt erst vorstellen können?
You can ward off the tanks with your bazookas. But those who were not applauding Goebbels still had to live with the war. A few weeks before the fall of Germany, Goebbels visited Görlitz together with Field Marshal Stürmer. There was still talk of the final solution. Goebbels shakes the hand of 16-year-old Wilhelm Hübner, a member of the Hitler Youth who'd been in action.
Dass unsere Soldaten, wenn sie jetzt an diesem oder an jenem Teil der Ostfront zur Offensive antreten, keinen Pardon mehr kennen und keinen Pardon mehr geben. Jene Divisionen, die jetzt schon zu kleinen Offensiven angetreten sind und in den nächsten Wochen und Monaten zu Großoffensiven antreten werden, werden in diesen Kampf hineingehen wie in einen Gottesdienst. Und wenn sie ihre Gewehre schultern und ihre Panzerfahrzeuge besteigen, dann haben sie nur ihre erschlagenen Kinder und geschändeten Frauen vor Augen, und ein Schrei der Rache wird aus ihren Kehlen emporsteigen, vor dem der Feind erblassen wird. So wie der Führer die Krisen der Vergangenheit bewältigt hat, so wird er diese bewältigen. Er ist fest davon überzeugt. Noch vorgestern sagte er mir, ich glaube so fest daran, dass wir diese Krise bewältigen werden. Und ich glaube so fest daran, dass wenn wir unsere neuen Offensivearmeen hineinwerfen, dass wir den Feind schlagen und zurückjagen werden. Und ich glaube so fest, dass wir eines Tages den Sieg an unserer Fahnen heften werden, wie ich je in meinem Leben an etwas fest geglaubt habe. Und für Adolf Hitler, Sieg! Sieg! Sieg!
German weekly newsreel, March 1945. The Führer, whose life is devoted day and night to working towards and securing the victory of the German nation in this war, visited a divisional command post on the Eastern Front. The officers were then presented to their Führer. Word had spread amongst the men that he was there on a visit. The warm welcome given by the soldiers was a mark of faith on the part of every active soldier in the man holding the fate of Germany and Europe in his hands, and the man who will ultimately rule over them. These are the last recorded pictures of Hitler. Young soldiers relate their heroic stories to the cameraman.
Ich habe zunächst mit 13 meiner Kameraden unter dem Befehl unseres Bandführers am Stadtrand von Hindenburg West gelegen. Diesen sollten wir gegen einbrechende feindliche Panzer sichern. Als diese dann aus der Richtung Gleiwitz am 24. Januar anrollten, teilte der Bandführer uns in 2 Gruppen ein, und während er mit der einen gegen die Panzer vorging, um diese selbst anzugreifen, gaben wir anderen ihm den Feuerschutz. Unser Bandführer hat 3 Panzer abgeschossen und ist dann leider bei der Vernichtung des 4. gefallen. Nachdem wir seinen Tod festgestellt hatten, mussten wir uns aus taktischen Gründen auf einen Eisenbahndamm zurückziehen. Und dort habe ich dann am Abend die unter diesem hindurchführende Straße von Gleiwitz nach Hindenburg, die den Zugang zur Stadt bildete, gesprengt.
Als der Russe näher an Lauban heranrückte, habe ich mich dem Kampfkommandanten von Lauban freiwillig als Melder zur Verfügung gestellt. Meine Aufgabe bestand darin, Meldungen zu den einzelnen Kompaniegefechtsständen zu bringen. Außerdem habe ich oftmals Panzerfäuste und Verpflegung in die Hauptkampflinie geschafft. Die Panzerfäuste habe ich auf Leiterwagen oder kaum unter feindlichem Beschuss in die Haarkeile geschafft.
The final struggle was relentless. The same bombing and artillery pounding was repeated yet again. This time it was Berlin's turn. The Red Army marched triumphantly into a city of ruins. Hitler, the author of Mein Kampf and perpetrator of its evils, abdicated all responsibility for his actions by committing suicide in his bunker. General Keitel signed the capitulation. In the aftermath, the German people were struggling to survive. There was a grave shortage of food and clean drinking water. Looting was rife. Anything would do in the barter for food.
Ich bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig. Rudolf Hess.
Nein.
Ich bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage für nicht schuldig. Herr Wilhelm Keitel. Ich bekenne mich nicht schuldig.
Nicht schuldig.
Nicht schuldig. Bin in keiner Weise schuldig.
Was it all Hitler's own doing? Unvoiced questions remain unanswered when the gates to the concentration camps were opened. The prisoners looked out at freedom. Their first steps in their new life were uncertain and cautious. These children were not sent to the gas chambers. The SS doctors had saved them for experiments because they were twins. In Sonnenburg, the SS had mown down the inhabitants of the camp before they fled from the advancing Allies. Nine million people died in concentration camps, including 5,978,000 Jews, 72% of all the Jews in Europe. What was left by the dead in the camps? Suitcases which carried their hope for survival. 500,000 items of clothing never to be worn again. shoes which carried them on their last journey, glasses which witnessed indescribable scenes, toys which children will never play with again, women's hair which did not find its way into the defense industry to be used as a raw material, teeth with the gold fillings taken out, approximately 25 million soldiers died on the various fronts, according to official estimates. The number of victims from the civilian population is estimated to be 24 million. Countless mass graves are proof of what happened. It must not happen again. Never again.